The Bible contains the mind of God, the state of man, the way of salvation, the doom of sinners, and the happiness of believers. Its doctrines are holy, its precepts are binding, its stories are true, and its decisions are immutable. Read it to be wise, believe it to be safe, and practice it to be holy. It contains light to direct you, food to support you, and comfort to cheer you. It is the traveler's map, the pilgrim's staff, the pilot's compass, the soldier's sword, and the Christian's charter. Here, paradise is restored, heaven opened, and the gates of hell disclosed. Christ is its grand subject, our good the design, and the glory of God its end. It should fill the memory, rule the heart, and guide the feet. Read it slowly, frequently, and prayerfully. It is a mine of wealth, health to the soul, and a river of pleasure. It involves the highest responsibility, will reward the greatest labor, and will condemn all who trifle with its sacred contents. Pray it in, read it through, live it out, and pass it on.
In Genesis chapter 16, verses 15 through 16, it says, "So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." This was Sarah's idea, but afterwards she became jealous of Hagar, her servant, and kicked her out of the house. Ishmael became the father of the Arab nations. Conflict today in the Middle East has to do with the struggle of Ishmael. Although the modern-day Arabs are the descendants of Abraham, God did not promise the land to Ishmael, but to Isaac. Abraham made a major mistake, but God still loved him and made a covenant with him. And the same applies to us today. God still loves us in spite of the mistakes that we make. Genesis chapter 17, verses 4 through 8 says, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also, I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." God's covenant sign was circumcision. Circumcision was to be obeyed unconditionally without question. Those who did not obey were not in the covenant. Abraham's obedience required the personal sacrifice of pain. Doing what God says may not always be easy, but it will bring promise and blessing. Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 through 14 says, "And God said to Abraham, 'As for you, You shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generation. He who was born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant, he who was born in your house and he who was bought with your money must be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. The covenant God established with Abraham was reestablished with Abraham's son, Isaac. Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 to 24. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? God was telling Abraham that something that was really inconceivable was going to happen. And Abraham really couldn't believe this. And Abraham's response said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. So Abraham took Ishmael his son, all who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Abraham was 99 years old, and Ishmael was 13 years old when they were circumcised. Key number 2. Our salvation today includes circumcision. Now, luckily, the circumcision of today is not the same as the circumcision in the Old Testament. Circumcision is still done in the New Testament church, but it is not performed with a blade or with hands. It is a spiritual circumcision called the circumcision of the heart. Romans 2, verses 28 and 29 says, a man is not a Jew if he is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Colossians 2, verses 11 and 12 says, in him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him by baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. Romans 6:4 says, therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of God, of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Galatians 3, verses 27 to 29 says, for as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So we can see that this covenant that was promised to Abraham in the Old Testament, we now partake of that covenant when we obey him through the covenant of circumcision of the heart by baptism. So where does circumcision take place in our salvation today? At water baptism. Water baptism is the cutting off or burial of the old sinful carnal man. Water baptism is essential to entering the new covenant because it is where spiritual circumcision takes place. This is how we become heirs of the same promises God made to Abraham. We inherit the promises made to Abraham when we are baptized. After Abraham enters the promised land, soon his nephew Lot moves away with a large number of possessions and lives in the most evil city in the world. So sinful, God had to destroy it with fire. But before God did, he visited Abraham and spoke to him about the coming destruction.